Alright, so now we're going to talk about the Node.js driver and CRUD operations using MongoDB. So you've already been using the Mongo shell to do these CRUD operations, doing create, remove, update, delete, having them converted to BSON by the shell and sent to MongoDB. So now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the Node.js driver, and we're actually going to write some application code that uses the Node.js MongoDB driver and takes your queries, converts them to BSON, uses the wire protocol, communicates with MongoDB. So this section is just going to be about how to use the Node.js driver and what the interface is to the driver. So the first thing we need to do is actually get some data into the database. So let's go do that. So I actually have this file, grades.json, and basically has one JSON object per line, has a student, assignment, grade, and we want to import this into MongoDB. So the way we can do that is we actually say mongo import, and then we give it a database name. We'll use the course database, and we'll use the grades collection, and import grades.json. Alright, so we just imported the grades into the database. Imported 16 objects, so let's just check that. So we can connect using the Mongo shell, we can use course, get to the course database, and we can do db.grades.find. We can see we actually imported all these grades documents, so we can use these when we're writing our example programs. Alright, so this program is an example of using findOne with the Node.js driver. So the first thing we have to do is require MongoDB to make sure we actually have a reference to the driver. So we say var mongo client, require MongoDB.mongo client. The next thing we do is actually connect to the database. So a simple way to do this is just to say mongo client.connect and then give it a connection string. And you can actually look through the docs for the format of the string for things like a replica set or a sharded cluster. But for now, we're just connecting to a single MongoD. So this MongoD is running on the host, localhost, and the port 27017. And we're saying that we want to connect to the course database. So we give it a callback. So we say once you're connected, call this with the error and a connected database. So down here, if there's an error, we just throw. And what we're doing here is we're saying, I want a query for all the students that got 100 on any assignment. So we say db.collection grades, take our already connected database and just say this is the collection we care about. And then we do findOne with our query. And we give findOne a callback with an error and a document. So what this does is it'll perform the findOne query against MongoDB, call the callback with the document that we found, and then we just log into the console. So let's just run this application. And we see we've logged one document to the console. Student Joe, assignment exam, grade 100, underscore ID was automatically generated when we ran mongo import. Now, you may notice that the value of the underscore ID field just looks like this giant hex string, but it's really an object ID type. If you remember, in the shell it looked a little different, but all that really means is that the toString method of an object ID, which is the function we call when we want to get the string representation of the object ID, is different in the Node.js driver from the way it is in the Mongo shell. So that's why you see a different representation here when we try to print out a JSON object that includes an object ID. So that's an example of using findOne with MongoDB. But what if we want to find more than one document? This is an example of using find with MongoDB, and it's pretty close, but there are a few things to note. So we connect in exactly the same way, we're using exactly the same query, but here what we're doing is we're saying db.collectiongrades.find query, and we actually don't give this a callback, and we'll actually talk a little bit about that later, but basically what this is doing is making a cursor object. And on the cursor object we can say .toArray, which tells the cursor we want all our documents that result from this query to be returned as an array. So this takes a callback, has error, documents. If there's an error we want to throw, otherwise we just say log the documents to the console. So now we can run this. We see we get back an array of all the documents where students got 100 on their assignment. So there's something else I want to mention about find, and for that we have an example that sort of separates the pieces and makes it more obvious what's going on. So here we connect in exactly the same way, we're using exactly the same query, but we're doing something a little different here. We're actually assigning cursor to db.collection.grades.findQuery. And the interesting thing about this is it means that this call is synchronous. It's actually just returning our cursor rather than taking a callback. So this is actually an important insight into what's actually happening underneath. So this is actually just creating a cursor object. So it's not actually doing the query. So the point of the cursor is just to describe our query and describe what we're looking for. We actually don't perform the query until we need some documents back. So in our last example, it was toArray. We did db.collectiongrades.find.toArray. And when we did that toArray call, the Node.js driver said, okay, the user actually is looking for all the documents and wants it back in an array, so we actually have to go do the query. In this case, we actually haven't asked for anything yet, so it can just make the cursor object and not have to do any extra work. But now, on this cursor object, we can call the .each method. This method actually takes a callback, and this callback is called for each document that's returned from the database. So if there's an error, we throw error. If doc equals null, that actually means our cursor has been exhausted. We're at the end of our cursor. This function won't get called again, so we can actually safely close the database. And if doc isn't null, we log it and we say this student got a good grade. So this is an example of how cursors work in MongoDB. Alright, so now let's just run this, and we can actually see a little message for all the students that got a good grade. So there's one more thing that I wanted to mention about cursors. So if you remember, I was talking about the fact that when you make the cursor, it doesn't actually query the database. When you make the cursor, you're actually just creating an object that describes your query. And nothing has actually happened to retrieve any data. So it's actually only when you call a method like .each on the cursor or .toArray that the cursor actually has to perform the query. So when you call .each, the cursor realizes, okay, I don't have any data, I actually need to query the database. So the cursor sends its query over, MongoDB sends its response, and the cursor can start returning documents or start building this array. But one thing I want to mention is that the response from MongoDB is not necessarily the entire result set. So consider a situation where you have a massive database with many, many documents, and you don't actually want to return the whole set of documents all at once. So what actually happens is that in this response, MongoDB will return a batch of documents up to a certain batch size. So in this first query and response, the cursor gets back the first batch, can actually start returning documents until that batch has run out. And then once that batch has run out, the cursor can make another request, get the next batch, and once that batch runs out, the cursor can make another request, get the next batch, and so on until it reaches the end of its result set. So one thing to note here is that this works very nicely for a function like .each, because we can actually process the documents as they come in, since .each actually calls its callback for each document that is retrieved from the cursor. However, if you have a function like toArray and you're using that on the cursor, the callback doesn't actually get called until the entire array is completely built, which means behind the scene the cursor is streaming all this data, but you're not actually getting any advantage from the fact that it's batching like this. So this is really meant to make it easier to stream data back from the database rather than have to wait for the entire result set before you can do anything. So this is something to keep in mind when you're using something like toArray. Alright, so now let's go on and do our quiz. So for this quiz, we'll actually have you complete some example code. So this is our example code. Just like in all our other examples, we get a reference to the driver, we connect, we check for an error, and we specify a query and a callback. But we're not actually using this query or this callback. So your task is to figure out what to put here to actually do this query for all the documents with grade 100, and call this callback. But notice this callback only takes a single document and logs that document. So it may not be clear here because this could actually be an array technically, but your quiz is to have a single document be returned to this callback. So your job is to figure out what to put here such that we run this query and call this callback with a single document. And once you figure that out, fill the answer in this text box below.